We are good to go to configure Liferay's document library. The document library or document and media library stores whatever we throw at it: binary files, text files, graphics, images, PDFs, doc files, videos, audio, anything goes. And we have a lot of configuration options for the document and media repository. Now, some of them are safely on the content side, but some of them are definitely on the DevOps side. And that is what we are going to discuss today. Well, the document and media repository is something that we can have multiple times in Liferay. Liferay can have or does have a bunch of different sites, any number of sites. One site is default, and we can have hundreds, thousands of different sites, and every single site has its own document and media library, which means we'll have the content in every single site. What does that mean? We'll need to store something somewhere. And as a rule of thumb, we always say the document library stores metadata, everything it needs to know about the content, the name, the content type, and various metadata that we're going to discuss, somewhere in its database. That's just the standard Liferay database, and you can't change it. There's another part, though, and that's the binary data that goes to a specifically configured place, which is typically, or by default, the file system. As it says here, stored in the document repository, the document binary data. Now, what does that mean? By default, we don't want to impose any vote to store binary data in the database. I know some areas where the system administrator or the database administrator threatens to throw me out if I would like to have a database, a relational database with a blob column in there, because that's just not what relational databases are built for. On the other hand, it's very convenient to just have it in there. And I know others where they say, nah, I couldn't care less. It's a few gigs, who cares? And there are others where they basically say every single blob is a mistake. There we are again at the DevOps policy. This is right and this is right, but probably not for everybody. Now, by default, we store in the file system, and that's what we'll cover a little bit later. And all of the metadata that we have, we'll summarize that in so-called metadata sets in document types. This is the content side of the document library that we won't cover. So all of those types where you store the author of a document, the content, a valid date for a contract. This is everything that goes into the metadata into the contract. We have a few additional other features where we say if you need bulk data into your document library, you can do so, for example, with Liferay Sync. As it says here, enables desktop access and sync. What does that mean? I like to summarize it as, think of your Dropbox client that just doesn't store somewhere to the cloud, but specifically to your Liferay DXP server. You can link to Google Docs, manage them inside of Liferay, quite new feature here. And we also have, we can add more applications, of course, to it. If we can write sync, you can write something else, which means a way to, for example, store bulk data in the document library, get bulk data out, filter them in any specific way. Everything in Liferay is accessible through an API anyways. So is the document library as well. So you can write your own components accessing the document library. And of course, we can integrate with external applications. After all, that's what a portal and in this case, digital experience platform is all about. It's all an integration platform to integrate with as many different systems as possible. We'll see one of our prefabricated integrations or document conversions right now in this training. I think we can safely only quickly go through the user interface because this is all, again, the content side. What you can manage here is you can manage all of your documents in folders, have shortcuts, and upload multiple documents with many different document types. What makes sense for us to discuss is one of the features in there, which is the repository. And that might be something that you are involved with as an administrator, but rather on a, well, probably not on a day-to-day level. We're discussing repositories a little bit later, but so far you can manage them, of course, through your user interface. Documents typically have MIME types. Probably no surprise for everyone, we can configure them. Based on those MIME types, we can generate previews, which means as we store the MIME type, not only the file name, you can actually access this MIME type through the API, write your own conversions, or you can filter them based on the MIME type, and you can also map different MIME types to different settings. So do you want PDFs to be displayed in the browser, or do you want them to be offered for download? There is the HTTP header that you can manipulate there. Whatever you want to do, you can do that on the basis of the MIME types. We do generate previews automatically. That is something that you can configure where you have another external component that you can use within Liferay. And we also extract metadata automatically. Now, what does that mean? Every Word document, for example, stores an author. Every JPEG has its EXIF data, where we will see certain information about the picture. Was a flashlight used? Which is the program that generated it? When was it generated? Or maybe GPS coordinates. So we can extract quite a lot of that data, and if you want to extract more of the data, you can do so as well. We have a couple of document MIME types that can be configured, and if I'm not mistaken, they're still in Portal Properties, but there's also a bunch of MIME types configurable in the settings. Those are the settings that can be used, or the MIME types that can be used for audio, for video. So they might get a different treatment on Liferay's end. For example, for videos, we can generate thumbnails. For the web images, those are the ones that our web content management offers for embedding images, so that Liferay knows what can I do with these files. Now, something that you definitely have to do, well, that is in your hands and not in anybody else's hand, as DevOps, as system administrators, is the document conversion. Liferay offers you to convert doc files, Word files to PDF, Excel files to open text documents or spreadsheets. You can just convert one into the other, and that happens through an external component. We not only generate the previews, but we also are able to convert from one format to another. Now, this is done with LibreOffice, or I think the user interface calls it OpenOffice, but it's basically both are interchangeable. You may or may not know the history of LibreOffice. It was a fork from OpenOffice, and OpenOffice is the open source version of StarOffice, which doesn't exist anymore. But basically my own personal history goes back. I was really happy to see this command in here, because back in the days, a few companies ago, I like to say, I worked in a company in Hamburg, which is the city that StarOffice, or Star Division, I think was the company, was in. And we contacted them because we had a document conversion based on Microsoft Word. Now, if you've ever used Microsoft Word as a service in the background, that's not what it's built for. From time to time, it just opened a dialog, do you really want to? And if you have that in a service, it doesn't work. Basically, the process freezes, which made us evaluate other options. We found Star Division, so later on, OpenOffice, LibreOffice, and so on, and collaborated with them on refining exactly this command. So you can run StarOffice or OpenOffice, LibreOffice in headless mode, and remote control it through an API to basically convert documents. That's a nice, for me, it's a nice segue into my history, nice memory. back to that time when this was, I think it always existed, but it was definitely refined during those times. Now, we can start LibreOffice as headless server. We can configure everything in Control Panel, as it says here, Control Panel Configuration Server Administration under External Services. So you'll gotta click in there quite a bit. When you go to Control Panel Configuration Server Administration, there you'll find a tab that says External Services, and you can enable the OpenOffice integration there. If you use OpenOffice or LibreOffice, doesn't matter. They both share the same API. And from the point of view of Liferay, they are the same. But of course, they have different feature sets as they are forks of each other. There is a little limitation in that as we are now running a Docker installation, we did not prepare a full Docker image for you, which would be a bonus. However, LibreOffice, as far as I'm aware, the best integration that you have with it is if both are running on the same server, basically on the same file system, because they are, or Liferay is somehow communicating with LibreOffice on a file basis. So if they have different concepts of where files are stored, then you might run into issues. So this best works if you're actually running on the same server, on the same file system. And if it isn't, then you gotta see something else. So this is probably the least Docker prepared integration that we have, just so that you're aware of it. It's working best. Even though we have a local host integration here, it's working best with running on the same actual server. And I guess in Docker, that means running in the same image, which is a little bit weird, but hey, if you want that conversion, you can have it. We have a little exercise for you. So technically, you can also extend your Docker image to run LibreOffice in the background. However, I'm not aware of a LibreOffice Docker image. I guess there's a Docker image for everything, so you can probably just find it somewhere. But how do you bring it into this Docker image? I'll leave that as a bonus. If somebody wants to do that, I'd be very happy to hear reports if it worked for you or what you needed to do in order to make it work. But the actual exercise here is to look at the MIME types that you can work with in Liferay, configure them, find the documents and media service, create a new MIME type that is not yet there, and you'll find the exact steps in your written material, in the books, or in the extra material that we have next to the videos. Export that new setting and test it. Now, what does that mean, export that new setting? This is something that we'll actually get into when we are working with the OSGI settings, with the settings on the user interface in Control Panel. Not only can you click around and, well, change some settings, and then they're dug deep into Liferay and you'll never get them out again, but you can actually export them. You'll get a config file or zip file with many different configurations, and you can use them in any other Liferay installation as well. So once you have configured one Liferay system, you export, and then you'll bring that configuration file into another system. And that is what you can just try in here without having discussed all of these concepts to a detailed point. And then after that, we're going to skip this new document type exercise and then go back to the review about the document management system, the document library. Now, before we go through the review for this document library chapter, I want to give you some heads up for what comes a little bit later. It would fit here and it does fit there. I have already mentioned that Liferay's document data, the binary data, is stored elsewhere, for example, in the file system. By default, it's in the file system. This is all configurable. We have a file system storage, which just dumps all of the binary data in a single directory. We have another one which dumps all of the binary data in a hierarchical directory, which scales better in today's file systems. That's just called Advanced File System Storage, and we're going to discuss this exact implementation in our clustering exercise. But just as here we are discussing the document library, there is something that you might want to configure anyways. Unfortunately, Liferay's long-time default storage for the document library is the so-called file system storage. And if you have thousands and thousands of documents, you might want to configure the advanced file system storage, which just scales better. There's another aspect. It's not only file system that we can use, we can also store our binary data in a database. And as I've mentioned before, there are some system administrators that will kill me for that suggestion, or some database administrators, and there are others who say, yeah, meh, who cares? That's fine, we just have storage there, dump them there, no problem. It's your judgment if you want to store your binary data in the database or not. I can give you another aspect for why you might want to do so, if that's fine with just the amount of data that you're storing there, which is a backup. When you back up your system, you might want to have an atomic backup of your database and your file system at the same time, because you have the metadata in the database and you have the binary data. Now, what happens when you do both? When you back up both, it might be off by a second. It might be off by one document. So if everything is in the same database, then yes, you'll just take your regular transaction log and you're done. So quite good, but it comes at the price of having huge blobs in the database. If you're not having huge blobs, but just tiny documents and just few of them, that's kind of a no-brainer. If you have large documents, if you have hundreds of megabytes of videos, then it might be a little bit harder to judge. But that's up to you to judge what do you have, what do you store, what does your business store in the document library. An additional point that was just mentioned here is the repositories. Now, the document library is organized in folders, and some of these folders can actually point to external systems, like SharePoint, like Alfresco, like Documentum. And we call that repository, and it feels like a mount point, as I like to say, for the file systems. You can basically configure a single folder in a single site to point out to a different external repository and transparently access those documents that are stored in your Alfresco, in your SharePoint environment. Now, it has a few limitations, because just by having them in Alfresco does not mean you can find those documents automatically when you search in Liferay's search index, because that would require Liferay to also index all of your external storage. Which means it's not a transparent replacement for just a regular access to that system. You gotta do something on top of that, but if you have this data stored, if you have these systems ready, then you can actually use them and just embed them within your Liferay system. Again, if that's an option for you or not, you've got to evaluate that. But if you look at repositories in the document library, that's where you have to look in order to see how can I create one folder that actually points to SharePoint. Quick review. There we are. Liferay's document and media platform provides the ability to store and organize files, any kind of files, binary files, text files, documents, images, pictures, media, just on that platform. And I told you about the unlimited amount of document and media libraries that we have, and that's per site. So each site that you have in Liferay can have its own document and media library. We can also be integrated with third-party, I would say third-party applications, and that's called Liferay repositories. But here my cheat sheet, if I go ahead here, my cheat sheet says this is integrated with third-party repositories. Well, it's a repository anyways. But, and then when you add a document to the document and media library, Liferay stores the binary content and automatically extracted metadata, and that metadata that you explicitly give it in a document type. That's as much as I want to say for now to the document library. And as I said, we come back to the document library within the clustering chapter when we actually go for the advanced file system storage, which I would argue is the one default that you should configure different from Liferay's default.